All right, this is the third of three programs on the nervous system. We're going to talk about the central nervous system, describe the most important structure, the brain, and then go and talk about a few more functions of the brain: memory, emotion, and language. All right, the brain is part of the central nervous system. This is the nervous system contained within bone, floating in cerebral spinal fluid, and surrounded by membranes. Um, the spinal cord really is just a reflex center. It carries information to and from the brain, and then is the center for some reflexes, like the knee jerk reflex. And all reflexes are very simple forms of integration or processing, where a sensory input is always matched with a following motor response. But in the brain, it's much more complex. You have processing that involves many more neurons. And so you can have multiple sensory inputs with many more than just one possible output. Okay, the brain is large, it's the largest collection of neurons in the body. The biggest part of the brain, shown on top there, is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres and has a thin folded layer on the top called the cortex. And it's divided into frontal, parietal, occipital lobes, and temporal lobes. And then underneath the cerebrum, in the center of the brain, is the diencephalon, containing the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, and those structures are shown in the lower diagram. And the thalamus is an important sensory relay, and the hypothalamus, a very small region, is an important region for the control of visceral functions, like the intestines or the heart rate, something like that. It also has behavioral drives like our thirst, our hunger drive, and contains areas that control development. Okay, then kind of protruding from the back side of the brain in red in the upper diagram and in brown in the lower diagram is the cerebellum. It's an area that has lots of neurons, another highly folded area that's involved in helping us learn motor activities, complex movements that might involve the whole body or just a part of the body. And it compares what comes in as far as sensory with what the brain wants and helps make sure those things happen. And then at the very bottom of the brain, shown in yellow in the upper diagram, and in the bottom shown in various shades of purple, looks like, is the brainstem. The most posterior part is the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Again, this is associated with visceral functions, controlling things like reflexes, like the movement of the eyes, breathing rate, blood flow, things like that. Okay. Again, the largest part, the part that's most interesting to us, is the cerebrum. Okay, and here's a top view and a side view. The top view shows the division into two hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere. And again, the lobes can be seen here nicely divided in the lower area. The cerebrum, I should point out, is where all conscious perception occurs, where we evaluate incoming sensory information, where we determine where all voluntary motion is going to happen. It concludes our center for language, memory, and all higher functions like judgment, impulse control, planning, all sorts of things like that. Okay, we can identify specific regions of the brain involved in certain types of activities, but often several regions work together to do a complex function. Language is one of these examples. It involves several areas of the cortex, particularly the left side of the cortex on the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, these areas include the Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's area is a sensory area that helps us decode speech, and Broca's area is a motor area that helps us make the sounds associated with speech. And these are particularly important in language because they communicate back and forth. And when you consider language includes reading, we also have some areas in the very back part of the brain that are involved in word recognition. Those are the visual cortex. And so all these regions have to be able to communicate quickly and efficiently when we're trying to have a conversation, to understand what our partner has said, and then to get our thoughts across. Another area that's even more complicated, that's involved in a simple function like that, is the limbic system. This includes part of the cerebral cortex and the frontal lobe. It also includes the thalamus and hypothalamus and other areas, and they're involved in emotions, recognizing emotions in others and our own emotions. And we can interpret sensory response to see if there's something that should be strongly emotional there. And we can recognize emotions in others. This limbic system is involved with multiple structures, and they provide feedback to one another. They are tightly connected and involved in more than one function. For example, a structure called the amygdala there in the central region is next to some of the memory regions. Okay, and when incoming sensory stuff comes in, the amygdala assigns emotional content to that. Okay, and it alerts the cortex, the frontal lobe, and it also can locate the hypothalamus, and so then help us take action and help change how the body functions. So it can raise our body temperature, increase our heart rate, increase blood flow. It does that very, very quickly. Okay, and so this limbic brain, you can see it kind of in the center there. These involuntary parts that assign emotions and change the function of the body work very, very fast. And then the cortex that works kind of a little bit more slowly can inhibit that those emotional responses so that we can stay calm when we need to. And that's one of the main functions of these prefrontal areas, is to control the thalamus and the hippocampus. And importantly, these areas are also very closely aligned with the areas associated with memory. And memory is quite, it's more than one thing. We have several different kinds of memory systems. Areas in our thalamus and frontal lobe cooperate to produce what's called sensory memory, where we can retain the brief sensation of something that's happened. Okay, for things like words or numbers or other pieces of explicit knowledge, we have short-term memory. And this allows us to remember something like a phone number for a few seconds, 10 or 15 seconds. Short-term memory, we recognize it as important, but most of it's lost unless the right things happen. If a short-term memory is deemed important enough through repetition, through association with some other existing knowledge, or through its emotional content, we might move that into a long-term memory called explicit or declarative memory. Okay, that's the retention of facts, names, and dates. Okay, we won't necessarily know that it'll stay there for sure, but it can be moved there. We also have some procedural or implicit memory, which is housed in a different part of the brain, and this is the development of skills, like riding a bicycle or playing piano. And that's much more durable. It lasts for a long time. Okay, so we have these different memory systems and structures. The key link with them is that amygdala and a part of the temporal lobe called the hippocampus. That's where those new memories are formed, although they can be stored anywhere in the brain. But it's important to know this because we want to know how memory works, and we want to be able to improve memory if we can. Okay, one of the most important things to recognize is that unless it's repeated, most short-term memory is lost. If you only read something once, it's unlikely that you'll remember it. But if you repeat it many times, it's very likely. Okay, and if the repetition involves doing something active like writing or talking or planning or actually acting things out, it's even more likely that you remember it. If we can link that memory to already knowledge that we already have, or to sensory inputs or motor activity, it's also more likely that we'll remember it. Likewise, if there's some emotional content, there's more likely we'll remember it. But an even more important thing is to know is memory is consolidated during sleep. Okay, we need to sleep to make sure that long-term memory lasts. And if we don't sleep enough, memory has a difficult time being formed. Okay, so we'll stop there. That's some of the key ideas in that chapter 11.